Welcome to Off the Shelf. I'm your host, Yvonne Wolf, and today our special guest is Monica Ong. She is a visual artist, poet, and graduate of Glenview Academy. Her first book, Silent Anatomies, has won an award in 2014 Corey Press First Book Award. And she's here with us. Monica, what inspired you with this work?
Well, there was a couple of really critical things that inspired me to start this collection. The first one was when I discovered a photograph of my mother and her siblings in my parents' things. And when I looked at this photograph, I could easily identify my mother's 4 sisters and her 2 brothers, but I had difficulty finding her in the image. And this was because my grandfather actually disguised her as a boy in this photograph, and he actually did that in family portraits for several consecutive years. When I asked my mother about this, she said that he did it because he was ashamed that he had had so many daughters, and that within the culture, having sons was seen as the true blessing, for families. So that kind of, spurred me on to thinking about the kind of cultural narratives that are written into women's bodies that often come with shame and negative value. And, and as a poet, I often think, how do we rewrite that story, right? Mm-hmm. And the other major influence in this particular collection was also my mother's eldest sister, so my aunt Ah-Ching is what we call her. And for most of her adult life, she actually struggled with mental illness. Mm. And although my father had attempted to help her, my father was trained as, in Western medicine and was a physician. He was often at odds with my very superstitious grandmother, who believed in her mind that my aunt was possessed by spiritos, or spirits. Mm-hmm. So, and it wasn't uncommon for many elders to kind of create these kind of folklore around these issues, because it was a way of saving face. Right. And as you know, in the Asian American community, families often don't like to lose face, or and they often want to protect their honor. But then what happened was that my aunt remained undiagnosed for most of her life and untreated. So her health, greatly suffered for this. Mm-hmm. So as an artist and poet, one of my goals is to think of art as a safe space, mm-hmm. To create dialogue mm-hmm. about health issues, particularly where health and culture intersect. Yes.
Well, you brought up many topics in the first 2 minutes. Yeah. My goodness, because the discussion of pathologies mm-hmm. sometimes has a whole entire cultural field, right? Absolutely. And how do you treat it, mm-hmm. in the cultural environment that mm-hmm. both can understand, right? Exactly. Who supported you in pursuing this work? Did you feel like a little resistance, like, oh, we don't want you to talk about this, or?
Yeah, I think there's definitely this idea of cultural silence, and of course, discomfort in articulating things, in a very direct and open kind of way, and which is, in a sense, when I think about who I feel really grateful to in this journey, I always think of my parents because they took a real great risk.
Yes.
Again, they are, although they have lived in the United States for many years, yes. They are still at heart very traditional Chinese parents. Yes. And when I after high school said, well, I want to go to New York City and study art, mm-hmm. I'm sure they had their reservations, mm-hmm. But they really stuck with me mm-hmm. over the years. And actually, when I was in graduate school, I traveled to China and the Philippines, mm-hmm. and I drafted them as translators, yeah. And people who helped me to track down documents and archives of our family histories. Mm-hmm. So
they were very supportive.
Yeah. So they were really great. And yes. And the other, I think, main support I think that's important for writers is to find a creative network of people mm-hmm. That help you to grow, because after you finish, college and graduate school, it's important to have a community mm-hmm. To help continually grow professionally. So I also loved acknowledging the help of Kundiman. Kundiman is an organization that cultivates Asian American writers and poets, and they have annual writing retreats every year. And we, often bounce our work off of each other. We talk about professional development and help to really, help Asian American writing be folded into, American literature as a whole.
Well, that's very interesting. I think that your relationship with parents, even grow from this, or you continue to grow from your work. I think that sometimes people who don't understand that you have another cultural background and cultural, let's say, expectations, that your parents are really brave, right? To say, I don't care what they say.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So what difficulties have you encountered? You say there's some, you had some help from your parents to translate for you, but what other difficulties may you have?
What other difficulties? Well, I think one challenge of the book was the fact that a lot of the poems in the book originated from a series of art installations that I did over the years. So the work is very much visual as it is, textual in terms of poems. So I had the challenge of trying to translate these sort of installations that often lived in large gallery spaces into a collection that occupies, an 8 by 10 page. So there were questions of scale and how to represent some of the works in a way that was legible but also true to the original intent of some of the artwork. And also to, aesthetics change over the years. So I noticed that between various exhibitions throughout my career, I would shift in, typography or even just aesthetic feel, and that's challenging because when you create a book, books tend to be designed with one particular style guide, one set of typography. So so I had to work with my publisher, and we also worked with an independent design consultant, and I also work as a designer as well. So we kind of really tried to step back and analyze all of these works as a body, and to kind of bring them together in something that feels very whole, very unified, but that still respects, the sort of original feel of the various works.
Right. I mean, in a gallery, you have interaction with each piece. It may not be such a coherent narrative, right? Which books expect you to have. So do you find that you miss some of that when when works are supposed to be an installation? How do you guide the interaction, right, with
So, I mean, there's a couple of ways. So what I love about the work of poetry is doing public readings, and at public readings you'll tend to see a poet reading at a podium from their book, and what I've decided to do was to do readings with projections. So by having projections, people can focus on the sort of visual aspect of the piece while also listening to the sort of narratives unfold around it. And I find that also people are more drawn to multimedia experiences as well. So that's been kind of
an interesting use.
Yeah, it's been really great with audience interaction, and also too the field of publishing is changing a lot over the years. There's this field of digital publishing that's opening up. So I'm also in talks with my publisher about doing a digital edition of the book, which allows for more interactivity, audio, video, those kinds of things. So trying to think about ways to represent the poetry in more rich multimedia ways.
So how has your education helped you to pursue your very unusual and multimedia work, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely describe my background as kind of a background of hybridity, and I think honestly though the seeds of that came when I was a student at the Glenview Academy of International Studies. And as you know, that's sort of a academic program that exists as a partnership with Glenview North and Glenview South High School. And it focuses a lot on, kind of broadening your mind, thinking outside the box. And I think it was there that I discovered my love of languages and literature. And it also has a lot of academic rigor. And so I found that I started to develop a lot of self-discipline, from a young age. After the academy, I was an art major, and I also went to graduate school at the Rhode Island School of Design in this area called digital media. And so, I work professionally as a designer now, so I'm kind of in that sweet spot between image and text all the time. And so, but I found that the personal narratives in my work were always at the forefront. So, so even beyond graduate school, I participated in a lot of different kinds of literary workshops. And a lot of workshops now are starting to become more multimodal now, so the Kenyan Review Writers Workshop, I was part of one of their first literary hybrid workshops a few summers ago. So, so there's a lot of shifting happening with literature, and I think it's because of the emerging technologies too that make it a lot easier to do that.
And very fluid and very interdisciplinary.
Yes.
So do you, excuse me, how long was the incubation period for your work? I know that, looking from family photos, that was your first story was a surprising experience. And what other things surprised you along the way?
So there was, this is a project probably, I would say, span a period of over 6 years as far as, this period of creating, installations from the work. The research for a lot of this probably went back a lot further. And I think there's a lot of surprises and things that you discover along the way. I think the best surprise that I got was how much my relationship with my parents changed while I was doing this, because I started the research in this book in graduate school in my mid-20s, and that's a time when, as a parent and child, the child is a lot more independent now. We lived apart, and so I think we were all in this kind of crisis of how do you relate to each other beyond, the parent-child relationship you have when you're younger. And then when we went overseas, and my parents became kind of more like people who helped me translate and research. We moved from parent-child to this more of a collaborator relationship. And I think it gave us an opportunity to relate to each other in a very creative way, where rather than looking at each other, we were both looking towards
a project together.
Yeah, like a common goal and a common mission. And I have to say that I think if it wasn't for the art, I don't think, our relationship would have progressed, in this new direction. So, so that was really great, and it was, again, I didn't anticipate that happening at all, but I'm really glad that it did.
Oh, that's a very interesting story, because sometimes, when you travel is when all these new topics, begin to unfold itself, and you probably never talk to your parents about those things, in Glenview.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how does organizing, you talked a little bit about organizing your work, but from installations to media, multimedia, it's hard to organize a book in this type of book. Did you have someone to help you, or did you work on by image or by poems?
Yeah, well, so it was really, when I was first looking at the manuscript, kind of this big puzzle. It's like a big jigsaw puzzle. And one advice that I got was to think about, what is the thread that ties all of this together, you know. And so I started to think of it from that standpoint, and I really found that the thing that ties all the pieces together is that idea of cultural silence. And I kind of grouped it in different kinds of expressions of cultural silence. So this idea of shame, you know, that obscures the woman's body, as well as the idea of social stigma around particular health conditions. But there's also this idea of lack of translation, you know, when you find yourself unable to find the words for things, but as well as the idea of like ghosted identities. And so I think by finding a theme that can move in different directions, you can then find room for all the different pieces that flow in a way that feels natural, even though next to each other they might not look that similar. But I think I also really believe that audiences are, you know, can pick up on these things in a very like subtle kind of way. So I found that it was very kind of an open process for me.
So do you find that you explain a lot about the culture, or you feel that it's up to the audience, the reader, to experience?
Yeah, so I mean, what I did do was I tried to create, I had a couple of poems placed strategically to sort of set up the cultural context for the book. There's a piece I wrote called Paper Sun, and it talks about the origin of our last name, and it sort of, you know, kind of sort of shows the migration of my family. So my grandparents' generation, they lived in southern China in the Fujian province, and it was during World War II, during the invasion of Japanese forces, that they fled to the Philippines across the water, and then set up shop basically in Manila. So that kind of sort of sets the tone for the book, you know, and I also have kind of an addendum at the end of the book that has notes for some of the references in the poems, because I do like to write using the multiple languages that we grew up with. My family, we speak Hokkien, which is a southern dialect of Chinese, and many overseas Chinese in the Philippines speak Hokkien. But then growing up, you know, my parents were born and raised in the Philippines, so they also had to know Tagalog. They went to school for Mandarin, which is kind of more considered a national language of China. And so there's a lot of mishmash of culture, and I didn't want to have to like explain them in the poems because
that would that would completely destroy the flow of the poem, right?
Right, exactly. And poems are so compressed, and they exist in such a concise space. So I found that having like notes in the end, I think, kind of added a layer of historical context for people, but could also sort of help explain or translate some of the words, you know, in some of the poems. So, and I think the other thing that I kind of did also with the book was, you know, I'm thinking about like silence and speaking and listening, right? So the first piece in the book focuses on the larynx, which is the place where voice occurs and where we speak. And the last piece in the book ends with a diagram of the ear. And so it's a way of me looking at the future generation, that if you want to encourage our generation and our youth to speak up about the things that matter, then we also have to be a generation that can listen to them. So I really kind of thought about this idea of speaking and listening.
A nice circle.
Exactly.
Images. So can you tell us about the influences of medicine and visual art in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book has, you know, as you know, origins in installation artwork, and so I have things like medicine bottle poems. So there are sort of these like narratives about cultural anxieties that I try to provide remedies for by creating these poems on vintage medicine bottles, using, you know, the photographs from my parents' archives. I also have a series of poems that are written often into X-ray scans, CT scans, ultrasounds, as well as another set of poems that use anatomical drawings. And what I love about anatomical drawings is that they create like an unusual structure for poetry. So I often will go to like sort of vintage medical ephemera shops, take these medical diagrams, and I will remove all of the original language, and then use that as a frame to kind of put pieces of poems or words all around the image, and I think it just, to me, invites a new way of reading, and also a different kind of linearity, because people are used to reading a poem left to right and top to bottom. And I think when you find these other visual frames for it, it allows you to enter poems from different directions, and maybe you find new syntax by having different kinds of combinations when you read the piece. So it's something that, to me, I feel affords a new kind of reading experience.
Well, definitely. I feel that the things you talk about, CT scans and just anatomies in general, right? These are not things people feel particularly comfortable with, and then you're drawing out all sorts of other emotions, and it's really a very interesting backdrop for poetry.
Yeah, exactly.
Would you have some future ideas for new books, or?
Yeah,
so many.
And that's the thing. It's like I'm
books?
really, I'm like kind of ready to work on some new materials for sure this year. I really I love learning new things when I work on a project, and as someone who has always lived in the sort of humanities, like art and literature spaces. I have a fascination with science, so yes, I'm actually yeah, definitely right. This one has all been medically inspired work, and so I think the next book I'm thinking about, astronomy, constellation myths, and how cultural narratives are written in those places. We have a lot of sort of like star or constellation myths of Greco-Roman traditions, as well as Native American traditions,
definitely, and Chinese,
exactly, from around the world. So
there's so many stories, right, about the stars, and people, and many cultures see the same bear, but then they have different stories about it, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah, and what's interesting is a lot of these stories are rooted in power struggles, and so I'm thinking a lot about these power struggles in terms of looking at the social challenges that we have today. So so I'm hoping that this next book will be an experiment with how am I rewriting some of these cultural shifts in light of what we see today.
What advice do you have for our aspiring writers in our audience?
So I think a writing practice has three important ingredients. The first is to honestly express yourself. So not censoring yourself, not doing what's marketable or likable, but being able to be the kind of writer or poet who is able to talk about the things that aren't said. And the second is to go somewhere new. I find that my greatest joy in working in the space is experimenting, taking creative risks.
And learning new things, right?
Yeah, learning new things, trying new things. And I think it's also the fact that we're here to contribute something new to the conversation, and I think also more and more with literature, there's a need for more diverse voices and diverse points of view.
Yes.
And I think believing that your voice matters and that it's important to put it out there. And I think the third part that's like the most important is making focused, committed time for it. I'm a full-time working mother. So I have a demanding job. I have, family demands. We all have, social, appointments, all kinds of things asking for our time. So I realized over the years that one strategy was to identify your golden hour, meaning having like one focused hour of time in the day with the least distractions and the most energy. And everyone is totally different.
Correct,
you know,
yeah.
like my husband's golden hour is probably more in the evening when everyone's asleep. And mine tends to be early in the morning when people are still sleeping, but when I'm really fresh and my mind doesn't have any clutter from the worries of the day.
Yes.
And I think that even though an hour doesn't sound like a lot of time, if you do it consistently over a long period of time, you would be really surprised how much work you're actually getting done. And I think it's also important that as an artist, like, you're not in your studio all day by yourself, you know, working on your art. It's important to live, to engage with people, to interact with people, because another important aspect of art is, you know, what are you contributing to the community and to the larger conversation, and we can't have anything to say if we, you know, don't live and really engage, you know, with the world around us.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Monica.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And thank you for joining us. See us next time on Off the Shelf.